Thanks for joining us tonight. My name's Jordan. I'm the Sustainability Education Officer at North Sydney Council. And tonight we've got running a webinar on climate biosolutions. Are we closer to solving the climate crisis? This webinar is brought to you by North Sydney Council in partnership with Willoughby Council tonight. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of North Sydney and Willoughby, the Cammeraygal people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Tonight, we have distinguished Professor Peter Ralph, who is the Executive Director of Climate Change at the University of Technology. Peter is internationally recognised for his pioneering work in algae biotechnology and the emerging field of biomanufacturing. It was 5 years ago he joined us on another webinar to talk about the nature-based innovations as part of the 2040 movie screening. And we're here today in part to talk about how those nature-based innovations have evolved over time and what role they now play in driving a sustainable society and net zero future. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Please send through your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll do our best to answer them along the way. So please give a warm welcome to Peter. Good evening, Peter. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jordan, and it's great to be back for a 5-year anniversary. It was really exciting when you first approached me to do this, because when we last did it, it was a reflection on the 2040 movie, and that was in itself really exciting. But I think 5 years, in a lot of aspects of science, society, business, industry, it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but wow, putting this presentation together, so much has changed, and not all of it's changed for the better. But okay. Yeah, I think it's been great as a reflection. So let me run through these slides, and this just gives us a structure. And if as Jordan said, I'm happy to answer questions either during the presentation or after. So
great, thanks, Peter.
So let's get this. Okay, so Jordan, has the slide progressed?
Yes, it has. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So what I want to cover this evening is I'll give you a quick introduction of who I am and where my background is in this space. I want to break down the change over the last 5 years, and I'm going to look at it from society, from science, from the economics. I want to look at it from a number of different angles, what has changed. Then I'll move on to what I see as the climate biosolutions, the opportunities. And they may be different from what was identified back in the 2040 movie. And I'm going to wrap up with the discussion about net zero. I think net zero is going to be very important for countries, organisations, NGOs. Everyone understands or has a different understanding of what they think net zero is and how we're going to achieve these goals. So that's what I want to cover. And so, as I said, please ask questions during or after. This is where I'm heading. So just a quick introduction to the climate change cluster at UTS. We're an 18-year-old research institute. We're about 100 staff and students, and we're addressing the global challenge of how society both adapts and mitigates against what's happening with climate change. So we need new sustainable sources of fuel. We need way more food and or less food waste. We need more sources of fresh water, and we need to absolutely remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that's what a lot of tonight's discussion is going to be, is strategies for removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And so the organisation that I lead, C3, or the Climate Change Cluster, I'm very proud to have been the founding director of it. And I think we have a group of researchers, and this will become apparent as a generational difference. The people in my institute are all way younger than I am. And this is part of how I'm seeing society pivot in the way that it reacts and it engages with the climate emergency and how things are moving forward. So we pride ourselves on being the largest group of aquatic researchers that are doing this type of work in the Southern Hemisphere. We collaborate widely and we're looking to understand where our impact is. So we're not as interested as most universities are on publishing papers and research income. We're looking to understand where our impact is, and part of our impact is getting our science and our technologies out of the university and into society. It could be through spin-outs, that could be through tech transfers and a whole range of different ways, but it's important that climate solutions are not just held within the university. They have to be shared and they have to be implemented by industry, by society, so that our entire community pivots. And that's what our institute is prided on. So our institute has 4 major teams and a research accelerator or an innovation hub. We have a group working on healthy ocean microbes. We have a group looking at how productive coasts can function. We have a future reefs group, and then we have an algal biosystems and biotech group. That's what I'm going to be talking mostly about tonight. And we also have this thing called the Deep Green Biotech Hub, which is a startup accelerator, and it's funded by the New South Wales government. And we're up to our 5th group of startups that we've taken in, provided training, and put them on their way of starting their new employment strategies and their investment strategies. So this is kind of the groupings that I work with. So, as I said, I want to reflect on what's changed since I last presented to the group that Jordan brought together. So I want to look at our understanding and a little bit towards our prediction of climate change. I want to look at the economics of climate change. I want to look at what our society is demanding. This is my perception of it. And then most importantly, I want to finish off with climate mitigation technologies. What has changed over the last 5 years? And I want to take the position that I spoke about at this presentation 5 years ago and look at the changes. So starting out with what we understand about climate change, it's kind of encouraging that the science is still the same. The physics and the chemistry of understanding climate change was stable 5 years ago. It was stable 10 years ago. Our capacity to predict future climate perturbations and changes has evolved, but essentially the science, we know that added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is warming the atmosphere and causing more extreme weather. We know that methane or nitrous oxide, all of these gases are causing the changing climate patterns. Now, it was interesting, these are the slides that I used 5 years ago, and the extreme weather 5 years ago I highlighted that Penrith was the hottest place on Earth on the 1st of April in 2020. It was 48.2 degrees. We had this massive slug of hot air that had drifted slowly across inland Australia and had dumped itself or stopped right on the Sydney metropolitan area. And that was amazing to realise that for that day, Penrith was the hottest place on the planet. The other things that were new in climate sciences was pyrocumulus clouds. We hadn't had terms, and it wasn't widely known in the climate sciences area, that you had cloud formations that were involved in the formation of fires, and the clouds would actually trigger fire fronts ahead of where the cloud front was moving. Mega blazes. We hadn't had mega blazes in our history before, and these were, as we all remember, blazes that lasted for 6 months. So that was what was climate change 5 years ago. What are we looking at now? In my mind, it's same, but different. We've got the same extremes happening, but they're just slightly different versions of it. We've got extreme rainfall, we've got flooding, we've had massive fires. So all of these extremes are just still continuing to be extremes. Whether they're more extreme, I think over a 5-year period, it's very difficult to say or to sense whether or not the extreme weathers is enhanced. But certainly we've got examples, and here's a few examples of the 2025 list of what I perceive as examples of extreme weather. So first of all, Cyclone Alfred. To have a cyclone form, you've got to have water temperatures above 26.5 degrees. Having that temperature of water just around the Brisbane region enabled the cyclone to actually track over water before it made landfall. If the water temperature had been cooler, the cyclone would have had to have moved further north. So we had very, very warm waters very far south. And the fact that it made landfall on Brisbane or near Brisbane, that's the furthest south cyclone we've had in 50 years. The East Coast floods, they've been horrendous. Lismore's been flooded twice in 3 years, and these are meant to be 1 in 500-year events. So clearly they're not going to happen once in every 500 years. This past March was the hottest March ever recorded in New South Wales history. That's not a good sign for our coming winter. And the time period since May last year to now, climate change has created an extra month of extreme weather for half of the globe's population. Now, this is going to cause heat stroke, premature death for elderly people. There's a whole raft of medical health issues of having extreme heat events. And now, in the last 13 months, the planet has got another month of extreme heat for half the world's population. Watching the Californian fires, the Pacific Palisade fires, was amazing. Seeing urban areas burn like they did. We're used in Australia to seeing fires that have come through a national park or through a bushland. They go up an escarpment and then they encroach upon urban areas. But these urban areas that burned in the Palisade fires were kilometre after kilometre of urban area. They weren't adjacent to forested or wooded areas. So these are some of the changes that I'm seeing in recent climate extremes. And I think they're no worse or better than what we saw 5 years ago. It's just different versions of a very, very warm atmosphere, a very moist atmosphere, where there's immense amounts of energy in the atmosphere, and that is making the prediction of what our climate is very, very difficult. But it continues to have many examples of extreme weather. Now, this is a nice way of understanding what's happening to our weather. I was reminded by this. I was at the Australian Museum last week for Matt Kean's Talbot oration, and he put up, or he showed us, the Sydney stripes. And I think this is a fantastic way of us remembering or recognising in a visual way what is happening to our climate. So you can go to the site, to the web page, show your stripes, and you can locate a region that you're interested in, and you can download this image, which defines the climate conditions from 1856 all the way through to 2022 at the moment. And the bluer are less below the average temperature, and the red bars and the darker red bars are above our average Sydney temperatures. That's why I put the small diagram. Not sure whether or not you can see my mouse on the top section. That's the normal way that we look at the climate changes to our local environment. But when you make the stripes, it's more of a visual representation. You don't see the magnitude of it. The colour defines the magnitude. And then what I've put in here is just some other examples of other regions around Australia. So that's what Perth looks like, and that's what Melbourne looks like. And so you can see that our changing climatic patterns are not consistent at a continental scale. They're not even consistent at an East Coast scale. We're having different fluctuations, but everything is clearly warming and everything is clearly getting more extreme in its weathers. So before I move on to the economic aspects, I like to put in planetary boundaries. And I think this is something that we need to keep track on. And this is a concept that was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And they said back in 2009, what are the environmental boundaries that climate change should not exceed? And you can see in 2009, they listed, about 9 different planetary boundaries. And these are ocean acidification, this is land degradation, this is water availability, this is nutrient runoff. All of these criteria, back in 2009, for most of them, we were in the green zone. And that means that we're not doing excessive damage to the global ecosystem that we probably can't come back from. The 2015, we'd exceeded one more boundary. However, between 2015 and 2023, which is only 2 years ago, we've essentially exceeded every planetary boundary. The only 3 that we haven't exceeded is ozone depletion, which we exceeded probably 20 years ago, and then with changes in policy, we've actually brought it back. Atmospheric aerosol loading and ocean acidification. They're the only 3 boundaries that we have not exceeded and grossly exceeded. So this is a measure by which the planet needs to understand why the climate has changed so dramatically, because there's so many parts of the ecosystem that supports human habitation of the planet have been exceeded. And this is quite a rapid and recent change. So yeah, I'd strongly suggest looking at this website if you get a chance. Okay, on to the second part, and probably in my mind, this is the most important part of what's changed over the last 5 years. It's the economics. The economics has become a much more important part of how what I'm seeing is society reacting to climate change. In the past, I felt that it was probably, Jordan, you'll probably be horrified by this statement. I felt that it was government that would deliver us policy that would pivot and change and solve climate change. In the past 5 years, what I've seen is that the economics of climate change has become much more important, and industry is looking at whether or not there's an opportunity there. And I think this is where I see the importance of understanding the business and the financial imperatives of climate change. So once again, from Matt Keen's presentation, he highlighted this book where they identified the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. So Matt reflected on that when he was treasurer, and he saw the cost of what the state government had to do to support and back in the massive costs of climate change to this state. And so companies and governments are now seeing that the economics of climate change, it is cheaper to fix the planet than to fix up the problems once it's damaged. Now, that goes beyond government and policy settings, that's moving into industry. Industry absolutely knows that it needs to change. Half an hour before I joined this presentation, I'm chairing a working group over in Europe. It's called Estanium, and this is a group of industries that have joined together to understand how their carbon footprints can be minimised. And these companies include Siemens, Faber-Castell, Merck Chemicals, and these are trying to understand what policy settings are influencing their businesses, but equally, what are the opportunities for them to decarbonize and to start moving into the bio-based economy. So I think industry through economics has absolutely changed. In Australia, to a lesser extent, but in Europe, to a large extent, corporate responsibility for climate change has absolutely become critical. It is now essential that climate reporting and ESG reporting occurs at a corporate level. Boards must disclose their emissions, they must report on their risks, and they must report on their actions. So now business is being held accountable for what its impact on the planet is. The Australian government has a range of safeguard sites, and I'm waiting to see how they pivot. They've got a 5-year period to address their emissions, and I think they're probably about 3 years into that 5-year period. The final economic thing that I've seen change over the last 5 years has been insurance premiums. I've always thought that insurance is a trailing indicator of climate change, but it's certainly a very strong measure of economic impact. Now, the graph that I've got there shows CPI, and it's CPI over the period from 1989. Now, I'm in my 60s. I remember how costs and rents and everything was tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Back in the 70s, everything changed a little bit according to the CPI. What this figure is showing is insurance premiums relative to the CPI and how much they contribute to the CPI. And so you can see the cities where the cost of insurance influencing the CPI is something like 6 times the cost of the base CPI. So that means the cost of vegetables going up and the cost of petrol, they're all part of the CPI. But the cost of insurance is a huge part of the CPI for these regions. And lo and behold, Brisbane is much more affected by insurance premium increases than states further south. The federal government's also had to invest a large reinsurance pool. This is money to help when there's underinsured or uninsured properties. So this is becoming a cost that governments in Australia and around the world are taking seriously. The final point on insurance that really struck me, I found out that when you're building a new suburb, you want to get lots of people to buy properties. Once people buy the properties, they build their houses, then you get roads put in, you get schools put in, you get all of the infrastructure put in. If the insurance isn't going to pay, or if you're unable to insure for the build because the region's in a flood zone or it's too extreme for to actually have insurance, you're not going to be able to build the communities. So without the building insurance, you're not going to get the infrastructure and you're not going to get the communities. So I think economics is playing a really interesting part in climate change. Put aside the science, put aside the technologies. In the last 5 years, economics has become much, much more important.
Peter, just a question around the
Please.
point two industry. Just a question around what a safeguard site was.
Sorry. And Jordan, thanks for interrupting, because on my screens I can't see anyone putting their hands up or saying something. So just chime in.
I'll just jump in. Not a problem.
So safeguard sites. So there's about 230, 240 large emitters across Australia that were deemed to be sites that needed to have a strategy to move forward for their carbon reduction. And these are coal-fired power plants, these are large petrochemical production plants, they're LNG plants, they're plastic plants, and they're scattered across Australia. And each of them, as I said, has a 5-year period to demonstrate that they're going to be reducing their carbon emissions. I've forgotten the percentage, but they've got a set percentage they've got to reduce every year. Now, these are the major industrial carbon emitters that are on notice, that have to demonstrate their path towards carbon neutrality. And so we're waiting to see what those emitters do, because a shopping centre, by comparison, is not nearly as large an emitter, but they're putting strategies in to have rooftop photovoltaics, they're reducing their emissions, they're doing the right thing, but they're a smaller emitter. The safeguard sites are the 200 plus largest sites across Australia that the government identified. So I think it's a place that we've got to keep an eye on, because they're the ones that need to be doing the heavy lifting. They need the solutions and they need to have action. That's why they had this 5-year window. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Cool. And please, anything like that, just stop me. Okay. What have I seen changing over the last 5 years? I wouldn't have thought that I'd be putting a statement in about social demands, but it's absolutely clear. The last 5 years has been really, really dynamic in what is happening from the social perspective. I started by saying, society remains divided, politics remain divided, and so we've got inaction. Perhaps with the last election, the last federal election, we may see some decisive moves forward. Perhaps we may see non-partisan policies developed in this space. But Australia has been dogged by a lack of consistency in our political capacity to develop policies. And I think that's hindered our progress. But I think equally, that's created a lot of concern. And this is what I'm seeing. And so a couple of months ago, I was on a panel to talk about climate anxiety for the younger generation. Now you can see the row of presenters there. I, in my lab coat represented both the science and the technical solutions, but I also represented the baby boomer generation of people that have caused the problem and are now passing that problem on to the millennials and the Gen Zs. And that we spent an hour and a half talking. It was a panel discussion and there was an audience, and the amount of absolute personal grief that so many of the younger generation, more so the millennials, are feeling, that I was really surprised by that. And I thought, this is something that I, as a scientist, need to be helping to diminish the anxiety, because the solutions are there, the social will is there. As I said a moment ago, the economics is almost there. So there's almost no reason why we aren't going to be able to start to address the climate crisis. But getting that message out so that we don't have generations of future leaders that are paralyzed by fear, this is part of fixing climate change, because so many people are not sensitive to it and are not interested in it, but they aren't in the position of being the next generation that is going to have to deal with it. And this is what they said is part of the reason for the last election, was that 47% of our voters are now millennials and Gen Zs. They are not baby boomers as the dominant voting bloc. So society is changing, and there is an increasing number of people that are making mission-driven life and work choices. And certainly what I see when I described the climate change cluster, and I said that I'm by far the oldest person there, I have 100 staff and students that are working in this institute that are all mission-driven. They are all purpose-driven, that the reason why they're doing the work that they're doing is to solve this problem. So, and I've been a scientist for 40 odd years, 35 years, and this is something that's changed. There is this very strong movement. The last point on that slide is consumer-led climate action, and that's not as strong as it should be. And my last summary slide will be my reflections on what we can do as individuals. And I think as we see consumer-led climate action increasing, I think this is going to be something quite interesting in the dynamics, and this is absolutely going to influence where business goes and how industry addresses it. So it's possibly an economic driver, but I've listed it under the social demands. Okay, the final reflection over the last 5 years is climate mitigation technology. And this is probably closely linked to the 2040 movie. And that was essentially a movie examining nature-based solutions and giving a snapshot of what the technologies were, how advanced they were, and so that people knew that there was a lot of work going on in nature-based solutions. So where do I think the last 5 years have been for climate mitigation technology? Unfortunately, I think governments have focused too much on adaptation rather than mitigation. So climate adaptation is how society learns to deal with a warmer climate. How do we deal with the health aspects of heat extremes? How do we deal with the health aspects of increased water temperature, more algal blooms, more toxins in the area? It's an important part of the puzzle. We have to do both adaptation and mitigation. But the problem with climate mitigation is it's really, really tough and it's really expensive. And this is becoming really important now that that group that I was on that meeting with just before coming online now is all about carbon trading. It's all about nature-based carbon trading, blockchains, how do companies develop a carbon portfolio. And the problem that we're having globally, not just in Australia, is that we've got to reduce our dependence on offsets. Offsets as a climate mitigation technology is losing credibility. A lot of systems across Australia and across the globe, when a company wants to mitigate its climate impact, it just goes straight to the offsets. And the offsets need to be robust. They need to be absolutely transparent. You've got to have a very powerful system for being able to verify that the carbon that you said is in this forest, mangrove, salt marsh, it stayed there. You've got to be able to demonstrate permanence. You've got to be able to have security for it. The slides that I showed you in the beginning of all of the mega blazes, the Palisade fires, as soon as you have a forestry system that is defined as your offset, unless you have an insurance or a secondary forest, when the fire goes through it, you've lost your carbon and there's no way of recovering that carbon. So there's a lot of risk associated with nature-based solutions in their simplest form as offsets. The Australian ACCU, the Australian Carbon Capture Unit System, was brought into a lot of question about a year ago. And so we've now got to reduce our dependence on offsetting and do the hard work, which is carbon dioxide removal. And this is where we're actually removing carbon from the atmosphere and doing something with it. And I'll talk more about that. This is where our institute is doing a lot of work, and that's carbon capture and use, not carbon capture and storage. Now, over the last 5 years, yes, the science and the engineering is evolving and continues to get better and needs to continue to get better and better. But what I've seen is we now spend a lot more time talking to economists. And this is really interesting because instead of it being about developing a solution and then making it a pilot scale facility that industry can invest in, we're doing those two processes, the discovery and the translation. That's a scientist and an engineer. But we're also now bringing in an economist to work out the business model that we can implement so that industry can do this climate mitigation, but they can actually not lose money. And so for me, that's really encouraging. That tells me that our approach to the climate crisis is getting more mature, and it's less about belief and more about an absolute functioning part of our society. And if it can be valued and worked on by economists, I think this is why we're seeing a lot more industrial uptake of carbon mitigation technologies. As I say there, industry knows it must change, and it's now starting to see opportunities, economic opportunities, where a green solution, as opposed to being a good thing for the planet, is a good thing for the planet, and the company can make a profit from it. And this is going to allow us to address climate change. Okay, so I'm going to spend the last couple of slides talking about the stuff that we do. I'm going to talk about carbon capture and use. I'm going to talk about algae. I'm going to talk about biomanufacturing, because this is where I'm seeing opportunities for new products that are allowing industry to remove the fossil components and still make useful components or products for society. There's no purpose. What I'm pushing is we need to be using society to store our carbon, so we make products that are useful, that have embodied carbon in them, as opposed to having fossil carbon in them. This way, we can have industry doing its part of net zero and fixing the climate crisis. So I'm going to be talking about the net zero economy. How do we make this, and what's critical? So, as I said before, the pages turned from CCS, and I think a lot of people know that carbon capture and storage is seen as a vehicle to support the fossil fuel industry to enhance oil recovery. That's why we need a different name, so that people don't mix up what you're doing to capture carbon and make stuff with it, as opposed to capture carbon and get more oil out of the ground. So that's why CCU is important. It's also going to allow us to create new industries, create new jobs, and bring in new investment. So some of the industries that need carbon capture and use is obviously fossil fuel plants, sewage treatment plants, cement manufacturers, and even breweries. Now, the first three of those would have been safeguard sites: power plants, cement manufacturers, sewage treatment plants. These are all large industrial emitters of CO2. Breweries are small emitters of CO2 relatively. And you can see there's an image of Young Henry's Brewery. We've been working with Young Henry's for probably the last 5 or 6 years. There's a carbon capture unit there where the emitted CO2 from the brewing gets captured by the algae. We now do stuff with that. We make animal feed. We're making methane reducing feedstocks. We've got a range of processes that we're doing with Young Henry's. I'll come back to that slide at the top. That slide at the top is a cement factory, and I'll show you a biorefinery concept that would be perfectly suited for a cement factory, where you emit the CO2 in the clinking and the production of the cement, and then you capture that CO2 into the algae and do something with it. But I think one of the challenges, and this comes back to the economics, is building supply chains. So as a scientist, I can identify solutions and fix a particular problem, but building an entire supply chain of a manufacturer that's going to convert algal biomass into a plastic chair, I've also got to have a farmer that's willing and has got a supply contract or a offtake agreement to actually build the entire supply chain. And this is one of the problems with the bioeconomy, is we're having to start from scratch to get all of the players linked together. It's rare to find a company that wants to vertically integrate everything. They currently, or take Young Henry's for example, they're a brewing company. They're not an algae growing company. Are they going to integrate algae growing into their business? Are they going to integrate a downstream processing and a plastic manufacturer into their business? That's highly unlikely. This is where we've got to get companies beside the emitter, in the case of Young Henry's or a cement manufacturer. We've got to get companies that sit beside those emitters, take their waste product, make something of it, and then send it on to manufacturers. And that's quite a challenge to build these supply chains. But once again, this is why the economists need to be in the discussion, because unless you've got the economists explaining the profit and loss of this supply chain, it ain't going to happen. It's amazing how many industries we can stick carbon into from the atmosphere or from an emitter, and these products will be useful for society. So just this afternoon, I was having a meeting with a startup funder for some of our building products. We're making products to go on the outside of buildings, fascias that are algae-based, and this is a way of capturing the carbon and sticking it into the built environment. You can put it into wall panels, you can put it into carpet tiles, you can put it into tables, you can put it into plastic chairs. We're putting it into fibres. We can make sustainable aviation fuel. We can make human food. We can make animal feed. We can make biochar. All of those things are uses of the carbon. Now, the fuel, the food, and the feed are not permanent stores of carbon, but plastic, biochar, fibres, and building products, depending on the life cycle of that product, are 20 years, 30 years. Even when you throw the product into landfill, if it doesn't break down, that carbon's still out of the atmosphere. So this is why the bioindustrial manufacturing opportunities are massive. We can take out the fossil components and put in a biogenic component. And just that last image there is a spin out that we've created called algae, and this is based around technology that's going to revolutionize the way that we can grow algae extremely efficiently and a very, very cheap price. And this is going to help getting it into value chains.
Peter, I was just wondering, just like how economically viable that CCU is, and is it scalable across different manufacturing industries?
Yep. Yep. Great question. And so where the economics come in is if there was a carbon tax, then everything we're talking about is absolutely cost effective. Without a carbon tax, we've got to deal with what's called the green premium. And so we've got to work out the cost of making our product is slightly more expensive than the fossil equivalent. And can we work out how we can get to scale quickly enough to bring down our operating costs so that then we are competing on an almost level playing field with fossil. So in the example of the Heidelberg cement, so in Europe, they have a carbon price on their emissions. So they are being charged for all the CO2 that is not captured. So they're already getting a price premium for that algae because it's capturing atmospheric CO2. In Australia, we don't have a carbon tax, and so Young Henry's isn't getting a cost benefit from capturing their CO2. I think to make the financial argument easier, there's a thing called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is something that Europe brought in 3 years ago, and products that are exported from Australia into Europe that have got carbon components in them will be taxed on that. At the moment, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is on steel, aluminium, fertilizer, and one other product. But after 2027, it's going to become a much broader group of products. So all manufacturers are looking at how they can measure their carbon footprint and how they can reduce it so that they can maintain a cost competitiveness. So a long answer to an important question is that we have to find economic measures that make that green premium smaller, because we are not at scale at the moment. Once we're at scale, whether we're making building products, fibres, sustainable aviation fuel, those costs will come down. But while we're getting to that point, our costs are not as competitive as they need to be.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So what is happening to the broader manufacturing industries is they're looking to understand what this pivot to net zero, biomanufacturing, circular economies, where we don't use manufacturing in its brute force, high temperature, virtually ignore the energy costs of whether or not you have high pressure, high temperature reactions. That's the style of manufacturing that we've had for the last 200 years. Style of manufacturing that we're going to have into the future is going to be much less energy intensive. And the quickest way to do that is to allow nature to do most of the hard lifting. And so this is where enzyme systems come in. You have water-based reactions, not solvent-based reactions. You have reactions that are at room temperature, not extremely high. You have reactions that are at ambient pressure, not high temperatures, high pressures. All of these strategies are coming as solutions to make our manufacturing more sustainable. Once governments and companies start asking the questions, how do I reduce my carbon? How do I reduce my water footprint? How do I reduce my environmental impact of pollution? All of those parameters come into bioindustrial manufacturing. And this will be what, over the next 10 years, we see industries moving to. This is going to both be economically worthwhile, but it's going to be sustainably worthwhile. And it's going to address the climate extremes because we're dealing with carbon, but instead of carbon being seen as a waste product or as a pollutant, we're sticking it into stuff that we need and we're using less energy in the process. So this is an opportunity for Australia. We've lost our manufacturing industries over the last 30 years. We don't need a lot of capital to rebuild it, but what we do is we rebuild it smart and we rebuild it as the future manufacturing industries. So we don't do everything, but we do a number of key areas. And I think there's a lot of interest from the government, federal and state, in understanding what types of manufacturing could we move into that are future ready, sustainable, and low carbon. So if this is such a great idea, why haven't countries, companies already done it? The image in the middle of the slide shows you companies that have already moved to bio-based products. The ones on the left-hand side, these are still not commercial, but look at the ones on the right-hand side, the area under the green arrow. Have a look for some companies there. Cargill, the largest food and feed manufacturer probably globally. DSM, Dow, DuPont, BASF. These are major companies around the globe that are already moving into bio-based products. They used to use high energy fossil-based production. Now they've swapped it. And I've got a couple of examples there. They're laundry detergents. So laundry detergents traditionally were made from petrochemicals. Now we're making them from bio-based enzyme systems, lower temperature, less water, less pollution, and these are some of the examples of what industry has moved towards. It was interesting, one of the challenges for this transition from heavy energy, heavy fossil use to the bio-based economy was energy. And Ross Garnaut presented his book Superpower at a meeting that I attended. And it was quite interesting that Ross absolutely understood the importance of the bioeconomy. he was aware of, pardon me, the opportunities with algae. But until Australia gets sufficiently cheap renewable energy, we're not going to move as rapidly towards the bio-based economy. So I think Ross's book, which is now probably about 5 or 6 years old, set a blueprint for what we need to do. But the thing is, Australia hasn't moved fast enough there, but it is going to be critical that we've got the renewable energies to support the bio-based economy. The final part of the puzzle, and this is something that I've spent the last month overseas looking at, is to make all of this bio-based production cost effective and zero waste. We need a biorefinery. And a biorefinery is a system that allows multiple products to come in and you repurpose waste products. So you take the primary product off, and then you've got 90% of your biomass, whether or not it's agricultural waste, whether it's wheat, rice husks, or algae. You take those products off and you make something else with it, giving you zero waste, but also giving you costs of scale efficiencies. And so Australia doesn't have any large biorefineries. Europe does, and the federal government, through the Marine Bioproducts CRC, had a mission to Europe. About 14 of us spent about 10 days traveling around Northern Europe looking at the structure of biorefineries, the financing of biorefineries, how you get companies adjacent to biorefineries. And I think we're bringing this knowledge back to Australia. So looking at this diagram here, if you see or if you remember the Heidelberg cement plant, the big ugly cement plant is the thing in the back, and the rows of green fences is the bioreactor. This is another diagram of exactly what a biorefinery is. I've blued out the cement factory, the petrochemical factory. The thing that's in blue is the old technology source of fossil emissions. We collect those emissions, we pump them into the algae bioarray. We've got a couple of factories either side of it that process biomass, process volatiles, and then we've got a big dome at the side, which is where we put the leftover biomass for anaerobic digestion and methane production. So this technology exists, and this is the kind of approach that we need to be getting governments, industries, councils on board to start finding how we can bring facilities together. So if we had an emitter and we had a bioreactor and we had a plastic manufacturer and then we had a fertilizer manufacturer, we could co-locate these all, and this is the beginning of a zero waste circular economy. But the thing is, at the center of that is going to be a biorefinery. And we need to start investing in the biorefineries and linking them to carbon emitters so that we can get carbon capture and use. So I'm going to wrap up by giving you some ideas on why algae. I keep talking about algae, but in principle, everything I've said up until now, any plant-based biomass could be used. So algal biomass, we've got 300,000 species of algae across the globe. There's no shortage of species. They can be used, both macroalgae and microalgae can be used in human food, pharmaceuticals. All of these things are possible. Whether they're at scale is the other matter. And this is my vision of what a circular economy would look like. We have the biorefinery in the middle, manufacturers around the side, biomass coming in, and waste circularizing around it. Where does this all fit with the net zero economy? Now, net zero essentially means that all of our greenhouse gases, not just CO2, are captured or are not emitted. So we've got to remove as much as you emit. And this is going to be quite difficult. And this is why I started out saying that we need carbon removal technology, CDR, and there's very, very few examples of it. Lots and lots of companies and countries and NGOs and councils have got net zero plans, but a lot of them are just based on offsets, and that needs to change. And that's why we need the manufacturing to come into play, and we need to take the fossil out and stick the biogenic in. So this is where I talk about defossilization, not decarbonisation. So carbon is in everything, virtually everything in society: fuels, plastics, fibres, household chemicals. We make so much of the plastics. I've taken as an example, we make 450 million tonnes a year of plastics. By 2030, by 2035, Europe expects to be recycling over half of it. About 20% is bio and about 25% is going to be carbon capture. So Europe's got a vision for what it's going to do with its plastics, and that has neutralised the fossil fuel industry. Unfortunately, at the moment, 99% of plastics are fossil derived. When we create a circular economy, then we're going to have the opportunity where we have new feedstock coming in, we make our products, we use them, and a large percentage of that is going to be repurposed. We feed it with new biomass, and this is going to be what the circular economy looks like. Unfortunately, some of the, I suppose, less mature renewables, such as algae, needs to get to scale, and the technology is there, but we haven't got scaled examples of it. And one of the big problems, and this is once again why I come back to the economists, is we need to work out our time to market, because if you get your time to market wrong, the investment's not going to work and the company's going to fail. And so it's becoming very important to have economists talking to engineers, talking to biologists. So the circular economy is an opportunity for us to take out fossil feedstocks, replace that with biogenic. We're going to have a lot of new opportunities for investment. They're going to be ways that the planet can be helped to reduce its climate extremes, but industry is going to be critical to this. And the circular economy is going to also solve water, energy, and carbon. It's not just about carbon. So I told you I was going to have a couple of suggestions for personal actions. These are different to what I was thinking 5 years ago. Think seriously about where your superannuation is and make sure that your superannuation is linked to a fund that does not support the fossil fuel industry. Similarly with your bank, think about your shopping habits. For those that are involved in fast fashion, that is a horrendous waste of resources. The amount, we're making fibres with a couple of fashion companies, so I'm quite involved in understanding the impact of fashion. So that is one way that we can really, and that's where Gen Z and the millennials can really help. Change your meat intake, reduce it to 1 or 2 days a week. And also for the younger generation, think about a startup, because startups is going to be the way that we get innovation happening. All of these could help with decarbonisation. So I hope, I realise that I've gone longer than Jordan and I thought, but I hope I've given you some ideas on the solutions are close. We know what we're doing. The economics is the challenge. It's about not just this individual mechanism, this product. It's about supply chains, which is encouraging. I think social demand is strong. Policy currently isn't addressing the roadblocks, but I think policy's ready to change. And I think small industry and startups are moving fast, while the corporates and the multinationals are still really slow to act. So there's some challenging comments. I'd hope that people may have differing views. And please, if you've got any further thoughts, my email address is there, and I hope this has been of use. So, Jordan,
Thank you so much, Peter.
yours to
Really
chat.
appreciate your time and your insights and sharing some of your experience in your research that you've been doing over the last 5 years. Yeah, excited to see where it's all going to go, and hopefully when we meet again in 5 more years, we'll be able to have a lot more Sydney-based examples.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a question from sort of Linda and Danielle around sort of advocacy. How are we advocating for sort of biosolutions to corporate and government? Yeah, is that happening at the moment?
I'm going to say no, not enough, not enough.
Mm.
I think advocacy, when will advocacy be called upon? Because I think corporates and government is listening to regulation. Regulation is coming through systems, but advocacy is not strong enough. And I wonder whether or not advocacy is struggling to know what topics or what focus should it be driving with. Is the science, is the economics robust behind the advocacy, and is that ready? And perhaps that's a conversation between those that want to drive the advocacy and where the technology is up to. Because, yeah, advocacy is absolutely critical. And I suppose, yeah, I'd love to see more of it.
Yeah, great. Maybe one more final question before we wrap up, just around local government and local communities. How do you think that we might be able to support biosolutions in the future?
I think one of the exciting things for local government will be finding opportunities to circularize your industries. You're not going to have the budget to establish a biorefinery, but if you had policies or thought processes that encouraged the positioning of companies and ownership of land and the people around them to make it circular, I think that would be really innovative. Part of the tour when I was up in Iceland, there's an immense area that used to be an aluminium smelter, and a startup hub is bringing in startups. And I asked them, how are you going to support circularity? And instead of them putting in each new startup into the space in a sequential way, they're going, we're going to put this person in here, and then we're going to work out who would be circular around them. So if local government thought about and encouraged and promoted circular thinking about the location of businesses, that would be amazingly impactful, because you're not going to just have random people located wherever the space becomes available, wherever the price is right. You're going to have a third measure of value, and it's, is there co-location potential? That'd be really forward thinking for councils to think about that. Sorry to make your life difficult.
We'll start working on that.
You've got 5 years.
Yeah. Thanks again, Peter. Really appreciate your time and insights. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We'll send out the recording in a couple of days.